King Sorrow is Joe Hill's fifth novel. Definitely not the worst thing that he's written, however, it's also not the best thing that he's written by quite a long shot. It was reading King Sorrow here that it occurred to me that Joe Hill is not a horror author, or at least not usually a horror author. He's a dark fantasy writer, or a fantasy writer with a really dark bent to him. Nosferatu and Heart-Shaped Box are probably the two that come closest to actually being genuine horror novels, but I think it's much more correct to call Joe Hill a fantasy writer than a horror novelist. King Sorrow is a pretty large book. It clocks in at about 881 pages. That is approximately 304,000 words, although Joe Hill himself claims 275,000 at the afterword at the end, so maybe you should listen to him about the length specifically. No matter which way you slice it, though, it is a fairly long novel. It took me most of about a month to get through, and I read at a decent clip, I think. Overall, I did like King Sorrow. There were some issues with it. I have plenty of issues with the book, but overall, I liked it a lot more than I disliked it. There were many moments that I thought were really cool. There were really moments that I thought were completely okay. There were other moments that I thought were genuinely a bit heavy-handed and sometimes overwritten. So let's go ahead and discuss the plot then. In the summer of 1989, a group of 6 friends summon and bargain with an ancient dragon named King Sorrow. They send the dragon to kill a pair of opportunistic thugs extorting one of the 6 friends, and all the dragon requires is that he gets to attack on Easter. But King Sorrow doesn't let them off so easily. When he said Easter, he meant every Easter, in perpetuity, until the end of their lives, lest they forfeit their own. Now, the basic plot did sound pretty fun. I felt like I was able to give it a little bit more leeway because it did not take itself particularly seriously. If it had the same tone as Horns, for instance, this book would not have worked. But it felt fairly tongue-in-cheek most of the time, which that was good. That felt proper for King Sorrow. My biggest problem with this book actually comes with the prose, the moment-to-moment prose. Generally, it was fine. He didn't really do too much that was wrong, until he kept going. He made his point, and then he would hammer it home. He would make the point, a fairly decent point, and then he would just kind of either state it again or double down on it and just like, well, okay, why do that? And he did it enough that it was just a little bit annoying. There were many times when he got the point across without ever having to directly say it, and then he would just also say it immediately after. And there is, unfortunately, a good deal of that happens in this book. It's by no means enough to kill the experience, where I made my way through it. I actually made it through pretty quickly. I enjoyed the book overall, but I did find it a bit annoying. The prose could have been significantly better. Out of all of his books, I actually think this one might have the weakest of the prose, but again, it's not enough to destroy your experience while reading it. And part of the only reason that I am so critical of this book is the fact that he wrote Horns and he wrote Nosferatu, and both of those books I hold very dearly. As a matter of fact, Horns is the only book that I enjoyed so much and was so emotionally moved by that I just immediately started it again. I've reread plenty of novels, but Horns is the only one that I immediately reread after I finished it. Joe Hill was not able to pull that same thing off with King Sorrow here. I liked the book, I liked King Sorrow, but it is Horns and Nosferatu are both a full head and shoulders above King Sorrow. One of the more interesting things about the book is how exactly it is structured. It does feel, in some ways, yes, like one very large, sprawling, epic story, which I'm certain is what he was going for in a lot of ways, but it also feels, in some ways, like 5 very loosely connected novels, all bound together in one volume. This book wears its themes on its sleeve. It is really not at all trying to hide what it's trying to say. It's pretty on the nose, and it was all right here. I didn't exactly particularly mind it because, again, it felt tongue-in-cheek enough most of the time that I didn't have to take it super seriously, which is okay. Thematically, the book is about a lot of things. Again, it's a very large novel. It's over almost 900 pages. It's close to 900 pages. And it covers a lot of ground. It's about grief and sorrow in 3 different ways, primarily. One, being overcome by grief and sorrow, being unable to feel grief and sorrow, and lastly, outright ignoring grief and sorrow, and the effects of those 3 different things on this group of friends variously, because each of them go through their own thing. Let's go ahead and discuss the characters. You see all of the characters starting, I believe it was in their early 20s, we actually meet them, and you get to see them through, I think it was maybe their mid-50s or some such they are at the end of the book. About 3 decades pass over the course of the novel, and we get to see these people mature as friends. Their dynamics of the relationships all end up changing over the course of the novel. All done pretty well. Joe Hill, his character work is always at least fine. Sometimes it's excellent, and in this book, for the most part, it was just fine. There was one really well-written character, and a couple that I just enjoyed. There was only one character that I thought was eh. Going through the characters specifically, Arthur Oakes is the first one that we're really introduced to, the first of the group of 6 that we really get to know. He is portrayed as a fairly wise fellow, although, he does make some mistakes in his youth. Everybody makes mistakes in their youth. And that mistake follows him throughout his entire life. He's racked by grief and guilt over one thing that he does when he's younger, and, hey, just whether or not you also think he should carry that grief with him his whole life, that's neither here nor there. But he does. That's the kind of person he is. Overall, he was not my favorite, honestly. It's not that he was bad or boring or nothing. I was just okay with him, at least for the first portion of the book. Later into it, I enjoyed it quite a bit more. Whenever we got to read about him and see him, just kind of chumming around from other people's points of view, from the rest of the group's perspective, I actually liked him quite a bit more. I just didn't care for him early in the book. Gwen Underfoot is one of the other characters, is one of the other 6 in the group, and man, I don't like her last name. I liked her fine as a character. She was totally fine as a character, but I don't know. Thematically, her name, Underfoot, it definitely makes sense. Her last name is another one of those instances where, Joe Hill was kind of on the nose with what he was trying to say. She is directly underfoot of somebody else, not only King Sorrow, but another individual kind of is able to... How do we say this without spoiling something? Another individual is able to kind of coerce and control her and keep control over her life. Yeah, Underfoot, it makes sense why he named her that, but I just don't particularly like the name. I don't know. She eventually goes on to be like an EMT because, very much like Arthur, she feels overcome by grief over what's happened here. They cause many deaths over the course of the book. And so she tries to become an EMT to try to balance out the scales, if you will. Van and Donna McBride, they are a pair of twins, and they're probably have the most interesting dynamic throughout the book. There is a long section in the middle of the book that just kind of is about the 2 of them, and I really enjoyed that part. That was my second favorite part of the book, probably. Van himself is just kind of a fun character, and I can sympathize with him. He really tries to cover for Donna, who is, boy, she's a piece of work. She really is not the nicest character ever written. I did not particularly like Donna, of course, but I do think that she's probably the best written character in this book. She has the greatest arc throughout all of them. She has the most shit to work through, and it's interesting to see. I don't know, I liked what he did with Donna, generally speaking. Donna is probably the best part about this book, honestly. Colin Wren is the 5th member of the group, and, this guy, every time I read about this guy, I thought of Steve Jobs, and not in a good way. I don't like those kinds of people. I don't like billionaires. Fuck those guys. And even though Steve Jobs was, dead long before we got to the current American fascist thing that's going on right now, fuck that guy still. I don't know if he was a symptom or a cause of a lot of the problems, perhaps both, but fuck him either way, because he certainly didn't help. Anyway, Colin Wren, I can't really say too much about this character because, it's just, we'd spoil some of the stuff in the book, because he's pretty intrinsically tied to a lot of the drama, so we'll hold off about that for just a second. I will say, though, that I was with Colin as well. I liked him, I guess, maybe a little bit more than Arthur, just as a character to follow. He was a little bit more interesting to me, but overall, The last member of the group of 6 is Allison Shiner. She's a gay woman who has trapped herself in the closet because she is in love with Van McBride, one of the characters we mentioned earlier on. And she keeps herself in the closet because she loves him. I think it's fair to say that she even actually does love him romantically, but not, sexually, of course. She's gay, so that's caused a lot of inner strife and turmoil for her throughout the book. She's very sweet, very kind-hearted. Honestly, Allison might be my favorite out of the group. We are now into the spoiler territory, so if you don't want spoilers, goodbye. This book is split into 5 parts. It has 4 interludes, and it has an epilogue. And each of the books is kind of not exactly segmented off from each other, but more, I think the best way to think about this is like each book inside King Sorrow, right? Each part of King Sorrow is almost like its own head on a chimera, right? All of them are their own individual moving beasts, but they're all connected to the same body and can work together in unison at the end. 2 of the parts were just downright good. 2 of the parts were pretty fine. And one of the parts was, unfortunately, just kind of boring. And the worst part about the boring part is that it's part 1. It's the opening part of the book, and it's the longest part of the book. While part 1 was far from being bad, it was also far from being great. However, it was hampered down by a couple of things. It's not entirely its fault. First of all, it has to set up the rest of the book, so there's a bunch of stuff that happens in part 1 that doesn't really play out until way later in the book, so it's just like, okay, Joe, why is this in here? But then, you wait 600, 700 pages, and then something falls out. It's like, all right, fine. Not only did it have to try to set everything up for the rest of the book, it also tried to have to work as its own kind of standalone story. So it was very difficult to juggle what he did. However, to criticize fairly, I do think that he could have pulled it off better. And a writer as good as Joe Hill has proven himself to be previously, he should have. Part of the reason why a lot of the stuff in part 1 doesn't work is because a lot of it feels a bit forced. Now, granted, for the way that the narrative plays out later down the road, a lot of the stuff had to work out the way that it did. But, did it though? Joe Hill is the author. He could have come up with something better, and so I think I have to hold it against him. Now, of course, any complaint that I have here obviously wasn't enough to drive me away from the book. I still was enjoying it enough to get through part 1. It was a little bit of a slog to get through that first 200 pages, but after that, it kind of kicked off, and I started enjoying myself quite a bit. Part 2 is, in fact, I think the best part of the book, overall. They're just stuck in this airplane in the sky, and there's a great little mechanic where a whole bunch of people are going to die unless one of the characters is able to murder somebody on this airplane. So, wow, that was really fun. The whole first 200 pages of the book, I was like, well, okay, if this is really going to be the speed of the novel, I'm not certain. But then we got into the airplane, and shit started moving pretty quick, and it was like, oh, okay, all right, we're pedal to the metal here now. This is pretty cool. It was in part 2 that we actually get introduced to the character of Robin. Robin Fellows, I think her name was, and yeah, I liked her. She was a fun character, generally speaking. So I did not expect her to stick around for the rest of the book, but she did. So that was nice. I appreciated that. Part 2 did not feel forced, really, at all. Actually, it felt like it really did flow from point to point to point. It felt nice and self-contained. It felt like it really just moved along. Part 3 is the part about Van and Donna getting kidnapped, and they're held in a government facility on a place called Cherokee Island. Very reminiscent in a lot of ways of Stephen King's Firestarter and The Institute. Kind of saw Van's death coming. I didn't exactly expect it to happen there, although in retrospect it was definitely set up properly with the whole falling thing earlier. It kind of works because it's at that point that everything twists and changes for Donna, and then, that she becomes easily manipulated by Colin later on, so on and so forth. Part 4 is fine. I enjoyed part 4 enough. It was okay. Wasn't great, but it was okay. The idea of Russia just farming trolls is fucking hilarious. I did giggle out loud when I read that part, so good on you, Joe. That part was funny. Part 4 is where, actually, it really struck me that this is a fantasy novel. It's not a horror novel. And that's fine. It doesn't have to be a horror novel. I expected a horror novel. I wanted a horror novel when I picked it up, but that's not what I was given. And at the end of the day, I was able to forgive it for it. Did see Arthur's death coming, but not too far in advance. I did figure he was probably going to stick around until the end. Up until, a few pages, maybe a page and a half, maybe 2 pages before Arthur actually dies. At that point, I was just like, hold on, some shit does actually kind of feel weird here. I started putting a couple of the dots together, but as soon as Colin put his hand on the sword and he was feeling sick and I was just like, you motherfucking, all right, goodbye, Arthur. I love you, bud, but fucking toodles, I suppose. Part 4 is a step down from Part 3, which is itself a step down from Part 2. So we've already hit the going downhill part of it. It has diminishing returns deeper into the book, but it's still well worth reading, I think. Part 5 ties up everything fairly neat, but again, in what feels a little bit like a convenient way. I wasn't super satisfied with the ending, and by the very, very tail end of it, I was kind of just like, all right, come on, let's wrap this up. Come on, Joe. Like, we're almost there. We can get through the door. You wrote a big book. He could have sped up a little bit more, which is kind of funny because in the afterword he very specifically says that he chooses speed over, exposition and shit, which is true to a degree. I do feel that Colin's death was a bit wasted, as was like the Elwood Hondo thing. I don't know, like I think the whole ghost thing really, like, sure, it was planted early in the book and it carried through a couple of times, but like, I really think that Colin should have been confronted by his friends and taken down that way. I do appreciate the fact that King Sorrow became an Ouroboros and ate himself alive. That was fun. I liked that. I don't know, it tickled me. Just on the heels of that, really just goes to show that Joe Hill did do quite a lot of research for this book, or at the very least, had somebody doing research for him for this book, and he was, it paid off. He was very knowledgeable about fantasy and fairy tales and dragons and shit like that. So, it was interesting. He paid lots of homage that ended up working. However, he also paid a lot of homage to specifically Stephen King. He specifically his dad, and he's done that in like every one of his books, as far as I'm concerned. All of them have had some sort of reference to Stephen King, and that's gotta be a weird position, like being the son of one of the most well-known authors in not only the country, but potentially just the world at this point. It must be hard not to want to reference your father's work, because there is so much of it out there to reference. On the other hand, like, it almost feels a little bit like a crutch for him at this point. Like bro, you are 5 novels deep. You don't need to be leaning so heavily into the Stephen King thing. It's like there are several times where he specifically referenced the Dark Tower with, blank fled across the blank and the blank followed. Like he literally used that structure to format several of the sentence thread. And sure, could that have been accidental or whatever? Maybe, but I highly doubt it, because in the afterword of this book, he's mentioned that Stephen King literally fucking read it and helped edit part of it. So obviously, I think it was pretty intentional. Another way that it feels like it is kind of an homage to Stephen King, although I kind of appreciate this one. This one's like a little more obfuscated and interesting, in my opinion. It feels like it is structurally and narratively almost an homage to Stephen King's It. Hear me out. Both of these are gigantic books about a group of friends that deal with an interdimensional entity over the course of several decades, and both are thinly veiled critiques of America turning a blind eye to violence. So, there is a lot of parallels between King Sorrow and It, and I kept thinking about that the entire time. So a lot of the criticism that Joe Hill levels with this book does feel, in my opinion, pretty fair, even though it is a bit heavy-handed or overwritten or feels a bit forced or contrived sometimes. The point still stands, at least, right? Guilt is a bad thing. You don't make Faustian bargains and stuff like that. Be careful what you wish for. His argument is very sound, but the book that delivers the message is really rough around the edges in a lot of ways. It could have, he had this book in the works for a long time. Reading the afterword, he said he worked on this book for several years, and then he put it aside, and then he went back to it for a whole year to work on it. Boy, he should have worked on it a little bit more, unfortunately, so that he could slim it down somewhat and just make it a tighter experience, and maybe, hopefully, fix some of the narrative contrivances that happen, particularly near the beginning and some near the end. But, it is what it is. In conclusion, I can't say that I'm unhappy with King Sorrow, but I also can't say that it's great. It was slightly above average. It was above milquetoast. It was far from great, but it was good. It was at least good enough to get through. This book does not quite deserve a B-, but it deserves a little bit better than a C+. So we are going to give King Sorrow by Joe Hill a C++. We're creating a brand new rating for this book, a C++, because, most of the characters were fun to read about. There were many well-executed and creative moments, but there were also just so many moments that felt contrived or a bit forced that it just took me out of the reading experience, or even made me roll my eyes and just made me think, Joe, come on, man, you could have handled this with a bit more poise, a bit more grace. But he did. I thought to myself several times while reading this, I could tell that Joe Hill feels much more comfortable in comic books these days than he does in prose writing. I think I could have rated it better if either A, the book was shorter, or B, even just a handful of the contrivances and forced moments were just smoothed over, fixed, changed out with something a little bit better. Even just a handful of them, I think I could have, one or two of them, honestly, and I could have bumped the book a little bit higher up. It was enjoyable, but it was a long experience that I don't feel like I'm going to have to go revisit. Unlike Nosferatu, I feel like I'm going to have to go reread Nosferatu again at some point. Horns, I feel like I need to reread that one again at some point. Heart-Shaped Box, that was good enough that I'm probably going to. King Sorrow, no, I don't think I need to reread that one. My name is Damien. I'm also an author. I wrote The Circus, an American fantasy, half of the short stories in Portraits in Bloodlines, and the stage play 666, or a play about stones and how to carry them. If you'd like to read any of my work, follow the links down in my description. It'll get you to a place where you can purchase copies. Thank you very much for your time. Hope you have a good one.